Dobrý večer všetkým. Vítame vás na tomto špeciálnom vydaní Stredoeurópskeho fóra s tým, že dúfame, že bude aj regulárne Stredoeurópske fórum v novembri, ako je vo zvyku. A dnes máme vzácnu príležitosť hovoriť s dvomi vynikajúcimi, nie iba ekonómmi, ale aj filozofmi, ktorí uvažujú o ekonomike ako o živej kognitívnej disciplíne a nenachádzajú sa v analytickom tranze. A diskusia bude prebiehať v anglickom jazyku. Pre tých, ktorí si nevšimli staničky, tak sú ešte stále k dispozícii. Na záver bude priestor pre vaše otázky a celkom na úvod pán profesor Joseph Stiglitz, ktorého srdečne vítam v Bratislave, ktorý si odskočil na pár hodín z Viedne, prenesie keynotes, poznámky o téme, ktorú nebudeme ďalej predstavovať, a potom sa k pánovi Stiglitzovi s pánom Tomášom Sedláčkom, ktorého takisto poznáte z nášho prostredia, aj ako vytrvalého hostia Stredoeurópskeho fóra, pripojíme na k diskusii na tému dokonalej búrky, ktorou v súčasnosti prechádza časť vyspelého sveta. Ďakujeme, že ste prišli. Vedzte, že ak budete mať zapnuté telefóny, tak budú možno silnejšie interferencie so staničkami. Môžete si ich dať na letový režim a veríme, že si dnešnú diskusiu užijete. Ešte raz, pán profesor Joseph Stiglitz. Pán Tomáš Sedláček. Moje meno je Michal Havran a budem vás sprevádzať týmto večerom. Ďakujem pekne. It's up to you, please.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. What I want to talk about is the current economic situation in Europe, globally, and it's a very, and what it teaches us about economics, and so it's a moment where economics is obviously very relevant, but there's a sense that many of our economic models haven't served us well, and the fear is that using those flawed economic models to design policies going forward will also not serve us well. So I want to begin with the obvious issues of war and inflation. It's very clear that even before the war, the pandemic was an enormous strain on the global economy, and the European economy, American economy. We don't normally shut down economies and then expect them to open up again overnight. And so we knew that there were going to be difficulties in recovering from the pandemic, but those difficulties have now been compounded by Russian invasion of Ukraine. And one of the important themes ideas I want to get across is this is a war, and yet both Europe and America are pretending that it's not a war. The consequences of Russia winning would be disastrous, I think, for the world. People in this part of the world know that probably far better than the rest of the world, but I think it would be a real disaster if Russia were allowed to win the war. But the West, and by the West I mean it in a more inclusive way, including people not in the West, but who are sympathetic with those goals, the people in the West have been trying to pretend this is a little incursion like in Afghanistan, Grenada, or some other little event that has no economic import. But Afghanistan could do nothing to the globe. A war in Afghanistan affected the supply of drugs, but that was the only major commodity that was affected by the war. But Russia is a major supplier of gas and oil, and unless the West had a coherent economic strategy, there are going to be, I think, severe risks of not doing as well as we would like. The first aspect of that should be obvious. If the West had been really successful in reducing the supply of oil to the global markets, and if the West had done nothing to curb the consumption of energy, the usual laws of economics is a product for whom the demand is relatively inelastic will see its price go up. And it can go up a lot. And it has gone up a lot. The increase in the price is almost surely somewhat exacerbated by speculation, exacerbated by the failure of cooperation of Saudi Arabia, another very democratic country. But if even in normal economic terms, the reduction in supply would increase demand, would increase the price of oil and gas enough that, in fact, the revenues that Russia would get from what it does sell, while smaller, would actually be greater than before the sanctions. So unless there was a coherent strategy of responding to the reduction in energy supplies, it should have been clear from the very beginning that sanctions would not be as effective as the West had hoped. And they've not been. Now let me say on the other side, the other side of the sanctions, depriving Russia of computer chips, of financial flows, of imports, of everything else on the import side, not the export side. The import side has had a devastating effect and will have an increasingly devastating effect over time. There are some reports like a third of Russia's domestic aircraft are grounded, and that is impeding commerce, obviously, within such a large country. So Western sanctions are working, but not the side that everybody focuses on, which were the export sanctions. They are beginning to work, but the cost that has been imposed on the global economy has been enormous and was mostly avoidable if the right policies have been put into place. Now, that brings me to the second topic. What would have been those right policies, and why did things go so, I think, so wrong? I think one of the reasons that Europe has been so badly affected is that the design of the European energy market was very flawed. It was based on a set of neoliberal principles, the principles of free markets, of pricing, we call pricing at the margin, pricing based on the highest cost source of energy. And that means that if the cost of gas goes up, a lot, electricity prices go up enormously, even if the cost of production on average goes up very little, even if there are long-term contracts that protect the generator of electricity. And the basic economic flaw here was a confusion or an overemphasis on the efficiency or allocative effects of prices, and an underemphasis on the distributive effects of prices, and a lack of creativity in thinking about alternative mechanisms of dealing with distribution and efficiency simultaneously. So an example of what I have in mind is illustrated by what is going on in the United States and even more in Norway. In the United States, we are not energy importers or exporters. We're basically energy neutral. And you would have thought because we're energy neutral, the shock of the energy prices would have no effect. But it's having an enormous effect. What is the effect? Well, consumers are paying a lot more prices, higher prices. What does that mean? It's a huge transfer from ordinary consumers and producers and businesses to the oil companies and the gas companies. Now, there are two broad theories about how you justify large profits. One of them is a theory that's called just desserts. If you work harder, if you are more creative, more innovative, you justly should get more profits. The other theory is exploitation. If you are more creative in figuring out how to exploit others, you get more profits. And there are elements of both of these in almost every company. Amazon was creative, but it is enormously exploitive. And Walmart is the same thing. It was creative in certain ways, but has been most creative in figuring out how to exploit its workers. And I could go down the list, but there's always a mixture of the two. Well, right now, if you look at the energy companies that are making record profits, you can ask, did they do anything to deserve those record profits? No. They should send a thank you note to Putin for those record profits, but it wasn't anything that they did, it was totally what Putin did. In fact, if you look at the market economy as a whole, you should say that the problems we face are because of a failure of the market. What do I mean by the failure of the market? If market had correctly taken into account the cost of climate change, if the market had correctly taken into account the cost of risk, and markets neither for climate nor for risk work well, but if they had correctly taken those into account, the impact of the decreasing supply of Russian gas and oil would have been much, much smaller. So the oil companies and gas companies are being rewarded for their failures. They're not getting rewarded for their doing the right thing. They're being rewarded because they didn't do the right thing. And in that sense, you should, I think in my mind, those profits are unconscionable. And therefore, what the European Union is finally getting around to doing, which is imposing a excess profits tax, a windfall profits tax, is correct. But it's late and it's too narrow, They're only focusing on the fossil fuel companies. And there are many other people who are also the beneficiaries of this lack of attention to resilience. Energy companies, there are food companies that are benefiting from the spike in food prices. So it should be much more general. The reason why it's really important to impose these taxes is in part that, what I said before, the allocative effects of these price spikes are very little. It's really quite remarkable. America does have the potential to increase gas supply, but it's not happening. Why? Because American producers hope that the war will be over, or worried that I don't know which is the right word, over very quickly, and if that happens, the price will come down, and they're not responding by increasing their production. So the price hikes, which are costly to consumers, are not having very large incentive effects. So the allocative effects, the efficiency, the steering effects are not there, but the distributive effects are very palpable, are very real. So the point I was trying to raise is the neoliberal construction of the energy market in Europe overestimated the allocative effects and didn't take a sufficient account of the distributive effects. Now, those distribution effects, I think, are important, both as a matter of economic justice, confidence in the economic system and the political system, but at this current moment are also very important in maintaining support for the war, which to me is very important. Wars are always political in nature. We saw that in the Vietnam War, and Vietnam was brilliant in managing that. The Tet Offensive was designed not to be a turning point in the war, but a turning point in the politics of the war, and it was. So the failure of Europe to grasp that this is a wartime economy and that you need to change the economic model to protect people, and that you can't, the previous economic model for the energy market was flawed. They should have learned that from California. We gave you an opportunity to learn that by watching our energy market, our electricity market collapse after deregulation. I assume in our conversation we'll go into some of the financial implications of this, but that I think is one of the important messages I want to get across, that it is important to do. The other thing I want to get across very briefly is about inflation. And I'll just give 2 sentences and then we'll begin. This is an inflation that is generated not by, or mostly not by, excess demand, which is the case of inflation often, usually, most of the time, but by increases of food and energy price. And you then always have to adapt your economic policies to the circumstances. And when you have demand-generated inflation, raising interest rates reduces demand and is maybe an appropriate policy response. But when you have inflation such as today, raising interest rates is not going to create more food, more energy, more gas, more oil. I don't think central banks have given any story about how raising interest rates is going to solve any of those problems. In fact, they're going to make it worse, because to address the problems of energy shortage, you have to make investments. And raising interest rates makes it more expensive to make those investments. It makes it, in the United States, one of the problems we have in inflation is higher rents. Increasing interest rates increases the cost of housing. So it exacerbates inflation. It's not even a cure. So if you raise them enough, you can cause a deep enough economic downturn that you can reduce inflation. But the cure is worse than the disease.
Thank you very much, Professor Stiglitz. I suppose that Tomáš has some remarks on issues that were raised by Professor Stiglitz, if you want to comment on it. I have a few questions too, but I will let Tomáš Sedláček to raise some maybe more questions about your keynote. Please.
I'll start with, because it's a dreary subject. I mean, economics used to be the dismal science. For a little while, we turned into the sanguine optimists. I think the whole field of economics, now we're back to dismal. But I'd just like to start with, if I may, the two stories that happened a couple of weeks before Professor Stiglitz got his Nobel Prize. He was in Prague visiting, I think, Search AI conference or honorary doctors. You must have all the confusion in these honorary doctors, don't you? And me and my friend Radek Špicar were students at that time. This was 22 years ago. It's always annoying when I do the calculations that the year 2000 was exactly 22 years ago. We had Skoda car with Radek, and we were supposed to pick up Professor Stiglitz at the airport. But the car couldn't stop, or it could, but then it couldn't be started again. So I couldn't really bring the car to a halt, so I had to kick out Radek. He went to get you, and then we threw Professor Stiglitz. This was really 22 years ago. We were all much more flexible. It was only a two-car, Skoda Rapids only have two doors. So if you want to have more than two people, one has to go through the front door to jump. It's difficult when you're about to receive a Nobel Prize and the car is still running. But we managed to do that. And the second one, this is one of my favorite jokes that I tell when people ask me about historiky z natáčení. We were at a similar conference at Search, and there was debate about the pension system or something like that. And I was, as a young student, I was sitting at your disposal, at the left hand, and somebody was asking a question, and Professor Stiglitz turned to me and said, "Hey, what's the mortality rate here in Czech Republic?" And I made sure that everybody heard it and that everybody heard the answer, and I said, "It's 100%." So, anyway, just to lift the spirit up a little bit. Well, as you know, I'm rather interested in the longer pictures and sort of the macro trends from the beginning of the civilization. So let me add to what has been said with a couple of remarks. If you compare the perfect storm, first of all, we must be really grateful to history or nature that these crises have the decency to come one after another, if you've noticed. There is no lock in the reel that prevents a pandemic, at the same time with a banking crisis, at the same time of a migrant crisis, at the same time of a European war, and have I left something out? And high levels of inflation. I mean, there is nothing in the reel to make sure that these don't happen at the same time. But if you compare these crises, maybe I could go even all the way to Enron, because that was the first crisis that I remember as a student. That was a very hard blow for us, because that was in the early 90s. We had, here in the post-communist land, we were trying to copy-paste a lot of things from America. One of them was corporate governance and the whole idea of the markets sort of self-checking themselves. And then the Enron crisis came, which was a big shock for me, and the 2008 crisis. Then came the pandemic, and now we're having a war economy. I think this is an exactly right description we have been studying economics in order to bring heaven on earth. That was what, at least my idea. That's why we do this. That's why Adam Smith wrote the whole Wealth of Nations, to help mankind be better. And suddenly we are now tasked with making that thing called economy a weapon, and trying to use the most malicious parts of economics to hurt your enemy, which in this case is Russia. Let me just say that one of the things, sort of an economic Hegelian spirit in all of this, if you notice, all of these crises are kicking us from the real. They are transporting us into a virtual world. Even if you actually decode the inflation, this is not 100% true, but the objects that are seeing the highest level of inflation would be material, little bit primitive, petrol, iron, coal. Services, inflation, not so huge. The more value added, such as chips and things like that, there you, ironically, don't see the inflation as strong as you see on the, I don't know how to even call it, the brute source of energy and economic growth, which we have been using for 200, maybe even since the beginning of 1800. As if, also price-wise, we were supposed to reallocate and, of course, use the current situation to exit the world of the real and start seeing the economy flourish in the more abstract realms. Which is also interesting, because if you compare the 2008 crisis and the Enron crisis with pandemic and now the war, to us economists there's a clear difference. I mean, to us economists there's a clear difference. The first two were endogenic, and the second one had really nothing to do with the economy. The first types of crises tend to have much longer lasting and devastating effects. In fact, if you compare, I just remembered, if you compare the Enron crisis with 2001 9/11 attacks, S&P 500 after 9/11 fell really sharply by 1/3 of the value, but the S&P was back to its original values within 3 months. Compared to seemingly insignificant Enron crisis where nobody died, it was an attack by American accountants against their own economy. That was a much deeper drop in the valuation of American companies, and it lasted for years before, of course, there was, dot-com crash as well. But these internal crises tend to have a much more devastating effects on the economy than situations such as war, floods that we had in Czech Republic in 2002, and also the pandemic. Isn't it a fantastic thing, in a way, that during the pandemic, did you ever run out of, I don't know, orange juice or anything? The economy was halted all over the world. Everything that we could have stopped, we stopped, and yet people didn't run out of, I hear that there are shortages of female hygienic products like we used to have in 80s. We were running out of sugar, and we were running out of razor blades, and now this is happening in America, which is quite interesting. So let me just because I think you should be the one speaking today. My addition to you is that this war is pushing us, economically speaking, in the direction that we wanted to go in a way long time ago. We wanted to be independent of Russian energy for maybe over even a decade. And this war, as you pointed out, our double standards, these double standards are now having to, deflate themselves. And it's good that we have a real pressure to get rid of the real. Thankfully, luckily, the economy is now at a state where we can do without these difficult but possible.
But we'll discuss that because we need a very strong leadership and public decisions to make it less harmful than could it be. But I will come back, Mr. Stiglitz, to the topics and issues you raised, because part of them is already published in your recent essay, Globalization and its Discontents. And it's not only about the taxation of oil companies or of International Monetary Fund, but you are trying to explain that there is something like what French call the prise de conscience, like we should realize, and you told it just at the very beginning of your keynote, that this is a real war. What does it mean? What does it mean if we accepted the idea that this is a real war with Russia?
What it means is that you are going to have, in relatively short time, reallocation of resources. Mm-hmm. And the basic thing about markets is that they actually work pretty well most of the time, as long as there's no big disturbance. You know, from one year to the next, they can move, they can adjust. People want to eat, more fish, they move to more fish. They make an adjustment gradually over time. But markets are not very good at very rapid changes and very big changes. And what you need in wartime is very rapid changes and very big changes. So, for instance, back in February, March, when the war started and it was clear that Ukraine wouldn't be run over in a few days by Russia, it should have been clear that there was going to need to be much more energy independence of Europe very quickly. You know, not in 5 years, but in
5 months.
5 months, exactly. So what does that mean? That means that you have to effectively commandeer resources. So you can build, you have the technology to build windmills or to build solar or to build LNG ports. So the technology is there. Normally, it takes, people have long-term contracts. People don't want to change what they're doing. So to build one of these plants, you might need to get steel that you couldn't get, or you might need other inputs that you couldn't get. And in the United States, for instance, we have an act called the Defense Production Act, which we haven't used very often, that says if you are in an emergency, you can commandeer resources. So to give you an example, related to inflation but of a different kind, we had one of the main sources of inflation in the United States in the beginning, before the war, but at the end of the pandemic, was a shortage of cars. Now, it wasn't like the United States didn't know how to make cars. And it wasn't like we didn't have the factories to make the cars. The problem was that our auto companies, except for one, forgot to put in orders for chips. And so they didn't have the chips, and modern cars are very electronic. They're very bad, the old style, but they didn't, even the old kind uses a lot of electronics, and they couldn't get the chips. So the chips have been diverted to making iPhones and smartphones that have been, Apple wants you to buy a new iPhone every 2 years. And if you had to wait for another half year to get another iPhone, it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. I mean, most people could manage that. The quality of the photo might not be quite as good, but they would survive, right?
Not on Instagram, but in real life, yes.
But we could have used the Defense Production Act to say, okay, the chips have to go towards cars, where we're having a shortage in our supply chain, and that's giving a huge spike to prices, causing inflation, causing a lot of distress in our economy.
Is this the main issue, the inflation and the structure of international finances today for you?
No, it's not the main issue,
Okay.
but it is a big, reason I'm worried about inflation is that because of inflation, central banks are going to raise the interest rates too much and cause a recession, and having a lot of people unemployed is a real problem. So it's not that I'm that, my own view is that we can live with inflation if we help the people who are most vulnerable.
Because you have evoked in your keynote the question of the coherent strategy, the coherent answer, not only to Russian war, but also to the economical situation. And there is also the climate crisis, the food crisis probably this winter. So, and when you look at us, we are like a Californian fireman. We are just jumping from one fireplace to another fireplace, you know. So is there any coherent strategy to manage all of these disasters all together?
Well, I mean, obviously, you have to be able to live in the short run to solve the long run problems. So, but fortunately, we're at a moment, I don't see that there being that much of a contradiction, because a major part of the strategy for not being dependent on Russian energy is moving towards renewables, which solves the long-run problem of climate change, which is an existential problem. So that's why I was hoping that Europe would use something the equivalent of the Defense Production Act, you know, to sort of mobilize resources quickly to build more solar, more wind, as an emergency measure. You know, knowing that the market is not moving quickly enough, knowing that the recovery funds of the pandemic, well-intentioned, they were good, but that they were designed to be a longer-term strategy. They weren't a 5-month strategy, or, you know, so what my view is, that part of the short-run answer can be part of the long run. And the really good news about all of this is that the cost of renewable energy has come down enormously in the last 15 years. I don't think people fully grasp that the cost of renewable energy now is basically cheaper than fossil fuel was just 10 years ago. So it isn't like we have to make a sacrifice. In fact, I would argue that even in narrow economic terms, we would have a more efficient energy system by moving much faster towards renewables and just using the fossil fuel system as the buffer, you know, for peak load. And the good news is we've already built those, so we can use marginal cost pricing on that. But you use that.
Tomáš, is the European Green Deal the right answer to these issues?
Well, if we've done it, yeah, it would have been. But now it's.
Is it too late, or?
But also in a way, I'm little. Okay, you have to divide what I say by 0. Or multiply what I say by 0.9, because I'm a known optimist. They now, you know, stop introducing me in the media as an economist. They start, this is Tomáš Sedláček, the optimist. So maybe I'll just have that on my business card. I'll be a professional optimist. I mean, if you look at what happened in Europe in the last, from February, only 5 countries are now dependent on Russian oil. I mean, Russian gas, which is amazing. And I agree that the high prices should be permanent. The problem is nobody's going to invest in alternative fuels if the fossil prices are exactly as you said. But when it comes to alternative energy, the problem is that you need a shock therapy to a certain degree. If I may, a little joke, okay, which demonstrates this nicely. They say that Hitler did one good thing amongst the 10,000 evils that he did, and that was unify the driving side in Europe, because before that it was a mess. In Czech Republic, for example, we were driving on the left, in France on the right. So half of the continent was left driving, the other half was right. And Hitler came and just, pounded the floor, the table, and said, okay, from this day on, the taxis and the public will be driving on the right-hand side, and everybody else on the left-hand side. And after a month, when everybody gets used to driving on the right-hand side, everybody will switch to the right-hand driving. You got the joke. Yeah, you can't do this. You have to have everyone switch to the same side. You can't do this. Other things you can, but when it comes to this type of energy, I would argue that it's actually good to have this sort of a shock. Hey, now there's a war. We now have to all transfer, stations, filling stations, battery stations. That does not happen gradually. The market itself wouldn't probably do this, or it would take too long. You need the government to say, okay, from tomorrow on, there'll be, battery charging stations every 20, 30 kilometers. Also, interestingly enough, we were today at the Museum of the Velvet Revolution at the castle. Czech Republic and Slovak Republic, especially Czechs, we are very good at revolutions. 1989 was a beautiful revolution. We got rid of a despicable system. We all agreed for a nice one, and nobody got murdered in the process. Also, the division between Czech Republic and I am half Slovak, yeah, just so that you know, moje mamička je z Handlovej. So I was always a federal child, but that was also very velvety. So but the reforms, you did much better than we did. So just to bring the point home, when we have a gun to our heads, we Czechs, and you have to literally change your exports 180 degrees, or from the east to the much more demanding markets of the West. We did that very, very, very well. But when it comes to reforms, such as pension reform, healthcare reform, education reform, judiciary reform, administrative reform, that you should do, but you don't really have to, nobody's really pointing a gun at your forehead, then we don't really do much. I'm afraid that this Russian shock therapy, if we really, and we do have a gun pointed at, so but an optimistic spin to the imperative of shock therapy.
I just want more, the additional question, because this is not the first issue, as you told. There was a pandemic. Before there was a fall of Greece, let's say. Then we had COVID situation. Then there is a war. We have inflation. We have the picture of society is very dark for most of the observers. And there is another aspect. The people are really tired of all of that. So what would be the issue from all this mess?
Well, there are many issues, but let me take one.
Because it is a perfect storm, you know. You're like,
yeah. So one aspect of the pandemic that was so clear is that we all turned to government to resuscitate the economy. If you did a thought experiment, what would have happened in the United States and Europe if you had the view, leave it to the markets? We know what would happen. People would have, the economy would have gone down. We would have had something probably worse than the Great Depression. And nobody said, could we afford it? Just like during the war, when we went to war, nobody said, can we afford it? They all said, we have no choice, and that we have to do it. in a fair way, in an efficient way, but time is of the essence, and so you compromise as you have to be pragmatic. But everywhere that could have, everywhere in the advanced countries, they turned to government as the mechanism for sharing risk and addressing what would have been a calamity. If you think about it even more broadly, the reason we were protected from the pandemic as well as we were from the health was because of public collective action. It was government investment in basic science, a real achievement of the enlightenment of science that had led to the mRNA platform, basic science that even understood what RNA was and mRNA, and then making it possible to think about having a basis of a vaccine based on these very abstract ideas, but making them really work for increasing the well-being of everybody. And then it was government support, billions of dollars, that said, we want to translate this knowledge very quickly to solve a concrete problem. And we threw a lot of money at it, but if you think about the amount of money we threw at it, it was a pittance compared to what the cost of would have been if we hadn't thrown the money at it. And it worked. And then the private sector came in, but the amount of money that the private sector spent was minuscule compared to what the government did. So it was public action that saved us on the health side, and it was public action that saved us on the economic side.
What is the impact of that from political perspective? Is it the return of a state authority or public governments, or what? Because there is some kind of change.
Yeah. So to me, the big lesson out of this, from a systemic point of view, is that we need to have my critique of the neoliberal is that it said markets could solve all problems. And markets create a lot of problems. They created the inequality crisis. They created the financial crisis. They created in the United States the opioid crisis. They created in the United States the childhood diabetes crisis. They've created, to a large extent, the climate crisis. But markets also have a lot of power. So you don't want to underestimate the power of markets, but the idea that just unfettered markets solve all problems should be recognized to be flawed. I mean, they actually create a lot of problems. So that's where my view is that you need to have a more holistic view of society where you bring private, for-profit markets, state, but also a wider range of what I call a wider ecology. So non-for-profits, NGOs, the best institutions in the United States. I mean, the basis of our economic strength are our universities. And almost all, not all, but almost all of the best universities are not for-profit and are not state. There are a few great state universities like Berkeley, but most of the ones like Columbia, Princeton, Harvard, Stanford are all private, are foundations, but they're not for-profit. Emblematic of for-profit institutions is Trump University, which only knew how to exploit other people. And so that's what a for-profit educational institution can do. It can be really good at exploitation. So it seems to me that when we think about our society, we should think not just narrowly in terms of the for-profit private sector and the state. We ought to think of a whole host of other institutional arrangements, depending on the circumstances, the time, and the country.
Tomáš?
Yeah, so I'll say something a little bit provocative, but why not? Capitalism does not destroy the environment. as much as communism did. It took us, maybe you as well, but I'll speak for the Czechs, it took us 30 years of capitalism to clean up the air of 40 years of communism, where there was a central planner who had all the rights to be illuminated, and yet the egoistic entrepreneurs in Finland, Austria, I mean, here you can see it beautifully from the castle. You see exactly where the borders are, and what could have been the problem in 70s or in 80s for a bureaucrat in the central committee of somewhere here to say install filters? Am I doing that, or do they hear us? So my great hope is that we can get out of this ecological crisis much rather the way that Finland and capitalism in half of the Europe did, rather than the disaster that the communist, completely non-capitalist mentality, and this is actually a double irony, because there is no better example of a common good. In Czech we say erár. I don't know if that exists in English. I don't think so, but we can give some translators some hard time. Try to translate erár. No, but they're doing it in Czech, so that's easy. Yeah. So I mean, what's a better example of an Aristotelian common pasture than the air that we breathe? Air is so common that I am inside you and you are inside me as we breathe today. There's other ways to get into you than the traditional.
Let me just say, the point about communism was it was an economic system, but it was also a political system, and it didn't have any democratic accountability, and that was, I think, the key flaw. And the problem, maybe I'm looking at this too much from an American point of view, where we have companies like Exxon that have been campaigning not to have environmental regulation. And we have one whole party in the United States that has been campaigning not to have environmental regulation. And the Republican. And remarkably successfully so. And companies taking full advantage, not all of them, let me say a lot of them are better citizens, but Exxon was spending money to convince Americans that climate change didn't exist. So, this is capitalism. Their view, and DuPont has a long history of polluting, the rivers. They could have, for every, the societal savings would have been 19 times what they would have saved as a company. But their view was, that's somebody else's problem. They believed at that moment in shareholder value maximization. And they said, our duty is to our shareholders, and the way we maximize that is to pollute the rivers. And so what if some people die? That's part of the price of living. And so that's capitalism.
That's the 100% mortality, right?
Yeah. So they died younger than they otherwise.
Advantage.
They would have died otherwise, but they died younger than they otherwise.
So we have more 30 minutes left. I would like to let some questions to be asked. But before, my last question for this evening was, by the end of the pandemics, there were some utopian articles, texts, essays saying that human society would emerge in a new shape. We will be more solidar societies, more inclusive societies because of the experience of pandemics. Did it happen?
No. That's the shortest answer I've given this evening.
It's okay. More questions.
I mean, you're right that a lot of us thought that having seen how the pandemic had exposed and exacerbated the inequalities in our society, there was a moment where it seemed people would want to come closer together. We saw the consequence of having a healthcare system in the United States where if you were poor, your life expectancy was so much lower and your vulnerability to COVID-19 was so much greater that people would say, this is not unconscionable. But instead, what has happened is, again, one of the two parties has become largely a cult. And they've gone in a direction that is really an inquiry into a different subject than economics, a subject in which there's been a little bit of writing called mass psychosis, that 80% of the Republican Party believes the election was stolen, that Trump is God, I could go down the list, and I don't understand it, but in terms of your answer, of the description of where we are actually more polarized than we were at the moment the pandemic ended.
Okay, thank you. So now we can take some questions. Probably we will need to have some microphone, but I will give you one. And you can, we have one hand-free microphone over there. It's coming already.
Stereo.
And probably you can...
So, thank you very much for your interesting contribution. My name is Pavel Shimova. It was very inspiring. What I would like to know, if you could give us some suggestions, what an ordinary citizen can do to provoke a change in the way of thinking and regarding this situation in Europe of real war, except for putting under pressure his local national politicians, except for structuring his private life in a way that the problem would be recognized. This is my first question. And the second one, do you think it's worth supplying the Ukraine much more weapons to pressure Russia to get out of the territories and to end the war as quickly as possible? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Please, it's up to you.
Yeah, so the second question is a question of military strategy in which I don't feel any particularly expertise, but it seems to me that convincing Russia as a whole that this is a war that they almost surely will lose is important, and because that will induce them to leave early. And that's why I think, again, to repeat what I said in the beginning, we should have recognized once Ukraine had survived the first few weeks that we should have begun the delivery of massive amounts. We may have delivered more than we publicly said, so I don't want to say, we don't really know what has been delivered. But it seems to me that providing as much equipment as we can, and there's a fine judgment. You don't want to provoke to escalate, and where that boundary is. But I think we've been doing what I think we should be doing more, and quickly, because time is of the essence. On the first question about what can ordinary citizens do? Obviously, reducing consumption of energy will have an effect on prices. You know, we don't see it individually, but when lots of people don't consume, reduce their consumption by 5%, that's a 5% total reduction. That affects price a lot. So, I think it's something that ought to be done by one of the things I didn't talk about, one of the better ways of dealing with the energy would have been to have an energy price, say electricity price, where if you consumed 95% of last year's, you pay the price you did last year. But if you consume more than you did last year, you pay a lot more. So that would have been a public way of incentivizing conservation without the huge distribution consequences. So that's an example of where breaking out of the neoliberal framework would have been helpful. Mm-hmm. But I think the main way is political. This is this is an example of collective action, and trying to persuade the relevant public officials that a commitment to winning the war and a commitment to doing all that's necessary to do that.
As we had this question about Ukraine war, the Russian war in
Thank
Ukraine,
you very much.
Thank you, and you have told at the very beginning that it would be disaster, the Russian victory. Can you explain a little bit more, please?
Well, I don't, in many ways, I mean, Russia's invasion of another country is such a blatant violation of international rule of law. The war of aggression, it really hasn't happened. If you look at most of the wars that we've had in the last 70 years, they've been civil wars. They have not been one country invading another, and particularly a large country invading its neighbor. So the violation of international rule of law, the war of aggression, is such a violation of international order that we tried to create at the end of World War II with the UN, that if we allow that to stand, it would totally undermine international rule of law.
Are you afraid of any trigger effect of?
What?
Are you afraid of any trigger effect in the case of Russian victory for other states, other countries attacking the other countries?
It just means that there's no international rule of law anymore. I mean, it just eviscerates that. And you have no principles anymore. I mean, there are some other issues which Russia has interfered with elections, not just in the United States, the referendum of independence in Spain. It's been a real force for in Brexit. And you have to understand, its objective here is it doesn't really care whether Catalan is independent from Spain. It's not a philosophical idea. In fact, it doesn't like breakaways. Its real objective here is disorder, because it has sort of a Trumpian view of the world, which is a zero-sum view. So if the West is weaker, Russia is stronger. And since Russia is having a very hard time becoming a productive economy, since the end of the Soviet Union, Russia has deindustrialized, become basically a natural resource economy. It's become less diversified. It's become and so its main strategy is weakening other states, and that has a very negative effect on many every place else. There are also, obviously very strong issues of human rights that it's emblematic of the opposition to all those issues. Europe is trying to keep this narrowly defined, not as a war of democracies versus authoritarian governments, but just as maintaining the international rule of law. But there is also an element of that broader international political debate as well.
Thank you very much. Nech sa páči. Another question. Thank you for Mike.
Thank you. Thank you for being here, and thanks to the organizers for bringing you here. My name is Stano Daniel, but I guess that doesn't matter. A comment on what Tomáš Sedláček mentioned, this anecdote with communism. I think we don't have to even look that far. We can look into Hungary, where there is all the political power to do the great things, and instead they do all the bad things. But a question to Professor Stiglitz, if I may. You mentioned that the current inflation isn't driven by the demand and supply, but is driven by exorbitant particular prices of some of the goods. And I'm just thinking, help me please understand this, because I think as soon as people are willing to pay that price, isn't that then the market price, and then we're back to equilibrium?
Yeah. So when we say that, let me put it a little bit in the context of the American political debate, and that'll help illustrate what I have in mind. Some on the right in the United States are saying the reason for the inflation was we spent too much in the pandemic, and all that money, which represented 25 to 30% of GDP, which was a lot of money, is what is giving rise to the inflation. So that is the change from what it was before that is giving rise to inflation, in that view. We've looked at that hypothesis very carefully and say, is the total demand higher today than it was in the trend before the pandemic? Are people spending the cash balances that they got? And the answer is very clearly no. Demand is not really very high, particularly high. In fact, demand has been relatively weak. We've had, a couple quarters of negative growth. And one quarter before that, the end of last year, the only reason that there was any growth was people inventory accumulated unintentionally. So it's not a demand side. That leads to the view it's not demand side. Now, when you have international prices of oil going up, that gets transmitted into your economic system. Globally, yes, it's part of, you might say, the equilibrium price, but it's a shortage. What has happened is there is a reduction in the supply of energy, a reduction in the supply of food, that is the driving force. So one way of putting it, it's not aggregate demand, which is the total demand, that's the problem. It's the relative demand, or the relative supply. We are lacking supply of particular commodities, food, energy, in the beginning, cars. And when you have that kind of microeconomic shortage, working on aggregate demand, which is what central banks work on, doesn't solve the microeconomic problem of the particular problems in that sector. It will reduce the demand in that sector if you cause a depression. But reducing the demand, aggregate demand, will show up only a little bit in food, only a little bit in energy. And so you have to bring down total demand a lot to bring prices down enough, and that means causing a depression.
Thank you very much. Over there in the middle, thank you.
Thank you. So I have a question. You talked about reducing our dependencies on Russia concerning oil and gas and switching to more renewables. But my question is like how you think about dependence.
Sorry, we don't hear you very good here.
Is it better now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so my question is on dependencies. You talked about reducing dependency on Russian gas and oil and switching to more renewables. If we did that with the Green Deal, would be great. But my question is how you think more general about dependencies on let's say, non-democratic regimes, because a lot of the technology that you mentioned, Professor Stiglitz, we do have, but we need the raw materials, the primitive things we still need from Russia. They manufacture a lot of the solar panels, they manufacture a lot of the steel that you need for the wind turbines. What did I say? Oh, I meant China, sorry. Thanks. So they're manufactured in China a lot. So will we build new dependencies on China, or do we instead need to like build a sort of almost an autarky or like self-sufficiency in, let's say, the democratic world of these technologies or manufacturing? Like, how do you think about this, like the globalization that we already did, and it's not going to deglobalize overnight, we can't just do it like this, but we're building these new dependencies. So should we get rid of them, or is it a matter of degree?
Yeah,
Thank you.
That's a great question, and there's been a lot of discussion in the United States. We call it friendshoring, nearshoring. One of the things that has become very clear in the last, I say, 6 years, is that borders matter. That the economic agenda and globalization from World War II on, and particularly from the end of the Iron Curtain, was borders didn't matter. And Francis Fukuyama wrote this very famous book called The End of History, which was we were all going to be liberal democracies and and we would all be converging. And that, at the time, that looked Pollyannish, it looked naive, and in the retrospect of 30 years, at this point, it looks really foolish and naive. So it's very clear that borders do matter. And it's not just bad states that make borders matter. U.S. and Trump show that borders could matter. So Trump has made people very aware of the fact that a country can just abrogate or ignore global agreements. So I think the implication of this is a real challenge, which is that one wants to take advantage of, you might say, classical principles of comparative advantage, advantage of specialization, but one also has to manage risk. And risk management means at least some degree of nearshoring, friendshoring, and you have to make judgments about what are your reliable friends. One of the themes that I think we haven't gotten into. You talked about talked about what you should do about strategically about Ukraine in terms of defense. There's a broader issue that Europe has to face related to defense, that the United States is not a reliable partner. It's a reasonably reliable partner, but everybody should recognize that our democracy is somewhat perilous. And that means it's really important for Europe to have its independent defense force. I think, in terms of risk management, put it in terms of economic terms, risk management says you have to have the ability to manage it if things turn out the wrong way.
Something independent from NATO?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, independent of NATO. So to answer your question, we're not going to be able to break our dependence on China overnight. But in the areas where dependence would be very costly, like technology, chips. The U.S. passed this $250 billion bill in industrial policy, something that we said countries shouldn't do. And the neoliberal agenda in Europe said countries shouldn't do. And you have all these rules in Europe, no state aid. We just passed a $250 billion state aid bill. And so Europe has to, I think, recognize that the world is changing and that those rules are not going to work in this new world where borders do matter and where politics are a lot more perilous than we thought they were 30 years ago.
Tomáš?
It's a really interesting thought. Let's go back to Fukuyama. I would advocate him a little bit. I think he was half right. I mean, he was perfectly right in the spread of capitalism. There is not a single island on this planet, maybe Cuba and North Korea, that is not using capitalism as its engine, including Russia and including China. So capitalism, we've exported actually really well. The democracy is the problem. In fact, that has not been exported almost at all. The Arabic Spring was actually, at the end of the day, disappointment. Democracy in Russia, I mean, we were all hoping that China would go the Hong Kong way. Instead, Hong Kong's going the Chinese way. So capitalism export, yes, almost 100%. I mean, what bigger victory could there have been between the great debate plan versus market that China having, this is also another irony, I mean, China has twice in its names that it's democratic. Democratic peoples. I mean, these two words are basically synonym, and it's, of course, it's not democratic. On the other hand, the most democratic countries in the world, especially in Europe, are no democracies. For example, United Kingdom, or Denmark, or Sweden, or Netherlands, or Spain. Those are all technically monarchies, yeah. But anyway, the only region in the world, if I am not completely mistaken, where both the export of capitalism and democracy was successful was in fact our Central European region, with big question marks surrounding Hungary, surrounding Poland, and at times Slovak Republic, at times Czech Republic, but by and large the ship is not sunk. So let me just add one more thought about what to do. This to me is rather a spiritual war. I mean, Russia isn't really interested in the territory of Ukraine, even, of course, you can cynically look at it. What was problem with Ukraine is that it ceased to be EU, but it wanted to be in EU. Of course, the joke is that both Ukraine and Moscow is geographically, of course, on the European territory, but they're not European. So we don't really need tanks in Moscow. We don't need Ukrainian tanks in Moscow, despite the fact that the situation is looking more and more favor in that direction. All we need is the same economic trick that worked in Europe between the hatred between Germany and France, the hatred between Austria and United Kingdom in 50s or late 40s was succumbed by the idea of trading, the idea of European Union, make trade, not war. If this idea wins over Moscow, which is exactly what Putin is fearing, then we have won the war. So, in a nutshell, in the same way like capitalism won over Chinese communism, this is how European spirit can win in Moscow. If we now start offering post-bellum Russia an accession possibility to the European Union. Do the same trick that worked after the bloody Second World War. In this, as critical as I am towards capitalism, these good tendencies should be harbored already today. So that's what we can do.
So it's time for last question this evening.
The questions are not the problem, the answers are long.
So there is one hand. Thank you. Whatever, it's up to you, please.
Thank you. I hope this is going to be a good closing question. It's also about risk management. So, each crisis we saw before was bringing reactions which were just, very urgent. Very often, in long term, the urgent reactions and even the best short-term reactions were not the best. So, what do you see from our best reaction right now as the biggest risk for the future? Oops.
Thank you very much. Thank you. What is the...
In the war or the pandemic?
No, even the economic. I mean, from the economic perspective. When we, for example, we will go to, we get rid of the fossil fuels and so on, we can just resolve the economic crisis, at the moment, the best way. But it may bring some problems which may show up in the future. Yeah. What do you think the problems will be?
Yeah, so, the chief of staff of Obama said at the beginning of the 2008 financial crisis, never let a crisis go to waste. And then he let it go to waste. And we did not reform very much. We did it some, but not deeply, our economic system. And we bailed out the banks to the tune of $700 billion. And a lot of commentators believe, and that one of the impetuses for Trump and the right in the United States was the view that the system was rigged, that we appointed as the economic advisor to the president the very people who deregulated the banking system and caused the crisis, and we gave money to the very people who caused the deep economic downturn, and we didn't help the homeowners, millions of whom lost their homes. And so that led to a view among a lot of people, as I say, that the system was rigged. I think that kind of that's part of what I sort of hinted at, that rewarding energy companies who didn't do their job of developing a resilient green energy system by giving them huge bailouts will reinforce, while homeowners are left in the lurch, will reinforce the view that the system is rigged. The companies always get rewarded. And that will feed into the polarization in our societies, which is really, I think, eviscerating our democracies and giving support to people who don't believe in democracy. So that's one thing. The second thing I worry about is that some people will, in the United States, this is not so much I hear this in Europe, but I do hear this in the United States, that the high energy prices are providing an argument for those on the right who want to do more oil drilling. As if that deep oil drilling is going to solve, which takes 10 years, is going to solve the problem of the next 6 months. I mean, but to a lot of people, they don't understand. So it is possible that it could exacerbate the green transition. But let me end on on an optimistic note. And those are the two things I've mentioned earlier. One is that these crises have in fact shown that we need a better balance between markets and government. That it is the weaknesses in our democracies and its weaknesses in an insufficient collective action that have led to the problems that we face. and that we do turn to government, and that if, as uncertain as the weather may be, authoritarian governments that control most of the fossil fuel are even more unreliable, and that we would be better placed if we put more of our energy into renewables. And so I hope that will be one of the things that will come up. And if that's the case, then this will not have been a crisis that has gone to waste.
So Tomáš Sedláček confessed being optimist. Are you optimist too, Professor Stiglitz?
Half. And
But the better half.
I mean, well,
Bigger half.
Yes. Okay. I think it's very difficult to live in America and be overly optimistic. Given how bad the politics have gone, quite frankly, we thought that after Trump got defeated by 7 million votes, and a resounding defeat, and after every court that looked at it said there's been no, this is to have 80% of, we have a two-party system, and 80% of the minority party believe that it was a stolen election is a question of mass psychosis. I mean, that's the only thing you can describe it as, and that's depressing when it's your own country. And when you see, we have strong institutions, and that's a positive thing, but if you have a strong institution like the Supreme Court taken over by fanatics and extremists who are living in the 18th century, that's a cause of pessimism and making, you are all familiar with the Supreme Court decision on Roe versus Wade, women's reproductive rights, but they've made a whole series of decisions that are equally bad about climate change, about the administrative state, that are so bad from a legal point of view that they're an embarrassment, but they also have deep political consequences for the functioning of our society. So that's the why I can't be completely optimistic, but just to end again on an optimistic note, the younger Americans, the students that I come in contact with, give me a lot of hope, and they are very different, and they're even more liberal than I am. So I think that's a good thing.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Tomáš Sedláček, pán profesor Joseph Stiglitz. Stredoeurópske fórum, myslím, že si budete môcť pozrieť aj záznam, ak sa mi zdá, že sme to aj natáčali. Ďakujem veľmi pekne. A ešte vlastne organizátorky, nie? Ďakujeme aj dámam, ktoré nám tlmočili dnes celkom vzadu. Ďakujeme Marte Šimečkovej, Andrej Pukovej, Roboj Pukovej, všetkým, ktorí sa dnes podielali na organizácii, a nielen dnes, ale od piatku. Laslo Sigety zdravíme tiež. Pekný večer, dovidenia. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming.